Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer, sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
You probably have a number of different ideas for things to do as a side project. Whether you've seen a gap in a market that you believe you can address, you don't like the tools that are already in that market, or you see a market that you really like. Ideas are everywhere. You're essentially swimming in them all the time. However, no matter how good the idea is, if you can't execute on it, you'll never release it. The tech stack you use at work to build things may not be appropriate for starting a side business for a variety of different reasons. In this episode, we'll discuss some of the things that you should consider when selecting a tech stack for a side hustle. A lot of these also apply if you are starting a small project from scratch within a new company. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Well, I am getting a new computer, or at least getting the new innards of one. Parts of the old computer are going to get moved over, like the video cards. Thanks, Bitcoin, for not crashing quite enough yet. I'm waiting a little bit before I upgrade the video cards and the hard drives.
Yeah, he's got a couple of boxes of just really cool stuff.
Yeah. And so I've got a new case, and I've got a new CPU and motherboard and RAM and all that jazz. Like all the stuff that's a pain to fiddle with is going to get replaced. We looked up the processor I currently have, and it came out in the fall of 2008.
Oh, wow.
So, and I've pushed it a long way, right? Like I've dumped more memory in there. I have, I added the SSD. I've got a bunch of other stuff I've done. I'm real careful about performance and that kind of stuff. So it's not been too bad, but the latest Windows update just totally started breaking stuff in a bad way. So I finally decided that, it's not going to be supported. Like my network card drivers, there are no Windows 10 drivers. It's using the Win 8 drivers badly.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just time. So I'm doing that major upgrade. Also spoke at NSS again this week. And I've got a thing I'll probably talk about here later in the show on that.
Cool.
But how about you?
So I'd forgotten what non-medical textbooks are like. I gotten used to reading medical school books, and even with development, blogs and tutorials are very succinct. They don't have a lot of fluff in them.
Well, they're not getting paid by the word, or by the page, right? Like it's the model there is, okay, I got to get this out and then go back to doing something useful, which is the same thing that your medical textbooks are under.
Well, with the medical textbooks, it's just so much information has to be packed into it that they don't have a lot of room for fluff. Like maybe once every 2 or 3 chapters, you'll have a little side story about something, but that's about it. The textbook I'm reading now for school, it's, oh my goodness, it is so redundant. They tell you what they're going to tell you, then they tell you about it, then they show you some examples, then they remind you what they told you, and then at the end they give you a summary.
So it's like a podcast outline.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. With a couple of extra pieces in there. I mean, and that's not even getting into the fluff, because the fluff would be, comparing it to podcasts, it would be our stories around it to explain it. And sometimes we will each tell a story or two, and I'll cut that down in the episode to just one, sometimes 2 stories if they kind of hit different points. But like we try to make that as succinct as possible so that we can get to the information and give examples of the information. Well, this is, it's a different world and a different way of reading. So I went at it, I gave it the med school try. Yeah. And I'm reading through this and going, I've already read this. Am I rereading the same page? And I flipped back. I'm like, no, it's saying literally the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And so, I had forgotten about that. Hopefully when I move up into some of the more detailed and like graduate specific to like data science books, they will have less of that.
Yeah, I think they will.
Because this is like a very basic learning Java. Anyways, we'll see how that goes. We had a really awesome lunch and learn yesterday at work. One of our UI developers and a fellow grad student, she's not in the same program as me, but she's also a grad student, Caitlin, did a talk on Kanban and like that agile methodology. where she demonstrated the process of kind of having an assembly line by having us make sushi.
Huh.
It was a lot of fun, and we even got to eat the product afterwards. So it included lunch.
Oh, that's handy.
Yeah, it was really cool.
I wonder if I could pull that one off at work just to get free sushi out of the company. We all know how to use a Kanban board. Nice.
Also ran into a friend of ours that we met through our meetup group yesterday, and we ended up going out for margaritas with her roommate. She was impressed that I was using a Mac at work now. And then as we got to talking, we figured out that I have the Mac that she had when she was there.
Yeah.
So it was fun catching up, and she was telling me about some of the side work that she's been doing. So it kind of like when I was writing down what I was going to talk about, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of correlates. But speaking of that, I've got something that goes right along with this episode for IoTs. So I have an article called 10 Most In-Demand Internet of Things Skills. Yes, this is a listicle or slideshow, but it has some really good information about the skills that you'll need to get a job or start a side hustle in the IoT realm. If you're wanting to turn your hobby into a career like I did with development, or wanting to make just a little extra cash working on the side in a fun area, this is a really great list of the skills that you'll need to succeed. I mean, many of them are kind of obvious, at least to me, like Node, GPS, security, but then there are some things that I didn't expect, like AutoCAD. And so each slide talks about the skill, how it relates to IoT, and the % increase in demand. So you can kind of determine which skills to focus on. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Who's talking to us this week?
We got a tweet from Adolfo saying, I really enjoyed this podcast. Always good content.
Yeah, he also linked to the show in the tweet. I didn't put that in there.
Very cool.
Yeah. Adolfo, thanks so much. We really enjoy creating it. It's a lot of fun. We're here every week doing this. It's just sort of a typical Thursday night now. So.
Yeah.
But send us a DM with your contact information, because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. Guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all our episodes to Google+, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. We're also on Instagram, Path, and Tumblr. You can check us out each week on Facebook and Twitter Live, where we talk about what's going on in the tech world and answer some listener questions. Or join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com.
Side hustles can be a lot of work. Not only do you have a day job, but if you're trying to do something on the side as well, every moment counts. While messing around with library compatibility problems, database configuration, and the like is part of your day job, you probably don't want to do very much of it after hours when you're just trying to get something done. Remember, the goal of a working side hustle is to make extra money on the side, not to be a vehicle for exploring a new framework, language, or approach.
Yeah, that would be a different thing altogether. That would be
study. It's a learning project.
Yeah. Now, when selecting a development stack for a side project, you need to maximize the amount of time that you have available for actually getting things done. This means reducing the amount of time you spend troubleshooting weird errors, digging around in configuration files, or trying to deal with massive structural changes to your workflow. On your day job, if you lose 3 hours to fighting with a configuration problem, you still have half a day left and you still get paid. On a side project, however, 3 hours of a configuration slugging match means that you don't get anything done and don't actually start work until tomorrow. In addition to wanting to get to where you can make money on your project, you probably also don't want to spend every waking moment of your life in front of a computer screen. So efficiency is really important here.
Yeah, and we're going to start by talking about the costs of tools and hosting. Then we'll get into the platform itself, discussing stability, access to help, deployment, and interactions with other platforms. Finally, we'll finish on mixed environments and languages. And the goal here is to kind of help you pick a tech stack that is appropriate for a side hustle and know the areas where the ones that you're using may not be.
Right. Now, bear in mind that these things are going to be a bit different for everyone. So we can only really offer guidelines that you may emphasize or ignore based on your own experience.
And so the first point is the cost of tooling. Now, this is a big one on a side hustle, especially if you're starting from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at work, I use Embarcadero's Delphi IDE. I would not have used it on a side project until very, very recently because they finally did come out with a free version.
Oh, really? I have to get this now.
Yeah, that's very, very limited.
But still,
yeah,
it's really cool.
And Embarcadero is a really cool company, but for a while there, they just had this boneheaded idea that like, oh yeah, if you want to get an IDE, yeah, that's $3,000. Like, you can't do a side project for that, right? I mean, you could use Lazarus and do that, but development environments have gotten a lot cheaper in recent years. The Embarcadero thing, $3,000, that's a lot. Visual Studio used to be, $500 or something. And then they had these, community editions. I forget what it was called. That were like a really stripped down version that didn't take plugins. And that was all you could get for free.
Yeah, it was Community is what they have now. Oh my goodness. Express. I had that and I remember I had that when I very first started learning, because it was 2015 where they came out with a community edition. So before that, I had the 2013 Express, and I was trying to get something done, and I asked you, and you're like, oh, do this. I'm like, I can't do that.
Yeah, like add a DLL.
Yeah.
And you couldn't make one. So yeah, it was stuff like that. So it's better now, but you do have to bear in mind that the low-end version of the IDEs may or may not be good enough for what you need. Mm-hmm. Now, this gets expensive if the low-end version isn't good enough. There's a paid one that is. If you get a JetBrains IDE, they're not that crazy expensive. But there's some others that are not so pleasant.
Oh yeah, I used WebStorm.
Yeah.
In a class that I took at work, and oh my goodness, I'm like, this is I love.
Yeah, WebStorm is good.
Yeah, I love VS Code, but that was even better than doing JavaScript in VS Code. I'm like, this is awesome.
Yeah. So that product is well worth it. And speaking of VS Code, it's free and it works pretty well for a wide variety of things. I've used it for everything from JavaScript to C# to batch files to Markdown. I even used it with .graph files where you use text to specify a directed graph. Yeah. And, had the preview thing where it would actually draw the flowchart with it. It'll do a lot of different stuff. So it's very slick, but there's use cases where it's extremely soft. For instance, if you're relying on things like Visual Studio GUI designers, you don't have those there.
Now, also, we've kind of hinted at this, but free versions of paid applications are reduced in their functionality, even the different levels. So the Community Edition isn't going to have as much as the Pro Edition, which isn't going to have as much as the Enterprise Edition.
Yeah, Enterprise Visual Studio is very, very nice.
And it's also very, very expensive.
Yeah.
I think it's like $2,000.
Yeah, I know people that have it.
With this, also consider the cost of the equipment on which you're going to run your development tools. Like with Will, especially just buying new stuff. If the platform is going to require you to buy a new machine to use it on, Apple has been bad about this in the past.
Yeah.
That's an immediate and serious cost that you need to justify. Now, the nice thing with Apple these days is you can actually buy cloud space to do things.
And get things done that way.
Yeah.
But that's still a cost, right?
Yeah. They've made it easier and a lower entry point to getting into being an Apple developer.
Yeah. Now, another thing that'll get you too is the hardware that you are running the actual. Yeah. So like if you're making an iPhone app, you're probably going to need an iPhone at some point in there.
Maybe there are services that will.
Yeah, that'll test it out. But I've not seen anybody be super successful with using like the emulated stuff because there's just always some weird little quirk and you don't see it until it gets on the real phone.
Totally, because when we were building the Alexa app, like in the SDK, there is a way to like test it. And like you type in what you want to say. You can even hook it up to your microphone and run it through your computer. But it wasn't until we actually put the app on a dev account on my Alexa that we found, these little quirks that we didn't quite expect.
Yeah, understand that if you look at an emulator as being a copy of a copy, that's probably a better way to think about it. It's not a copy. It's got some it's lossy. Mm-hmm. In terms of what it'll do. Now, you also have to consider how using existing hardware is going to impact your home situation. So, like, let's say that you and your wife and kids have got multiple machines, but only one of them can actually run a development environment, and that one happens to also be the only one that can run Fortnite. Right now, you're going to have an issue.
Yep.
Like, that's going to be a point of friction. So don't forget that.
That's why you have everybody do console gaming.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother can of worms there. Or just have them use Minecraft, and then it's like, oh, your graphics look like they're from 1994 anyway.
Yeah. Also, be sure and consider what happens on a shared computer if one of the other users messes with your stuff.
Yeah, I've known people that have tried to start side businesses, and for instance, their spouse, unhealthy browsing habits, to put it, keep it very PG. And yeah, their stuff got locked up by ransomware.
Yep.
And, what do you do if you don't have backups somewhere, which probably you don't if you also have that kind of stuff going on? Like, that's a problem. So you got to think about these things a lot before you do stuff.
So finally, under tooling, we need to talk about, and I hate that we even have to talk about this, but
yeah, no, it's like, here's why you don't stick your finger in the electrical outlet.
Yeah, this is something we shouldn't have to say.
Use a fork, it'll go further.
But we know too many people that have to not mention this, but do not use the software and tools of your development environment from work.
Yeah, in other words, don't remote into your work machine and do your stuff. Don't take your stuff to the office and do it. Don't use a license from work at home to do that.
I mean, this is why even though it was just a proof of concept, when Dave and I built the Alexa app, we created a separate developer email address to create an Amazon account with it. And so, like, we jumped through those hoops just so that we didn't put it on our own personal stuff.
I mean, it's morally dodgy at best, right? Like, that goes without saying, because you're not paying for a license that you're using. It can also be bad if your side hustle gets wildly successful and your work finds out that you use their licenses and equipment, because they may have a legal case against you. Yeah,
I know a lot of places, they'll make you sign. It's kind of the case, if you build it on our machines with our stuff, we own it.
Yeah.
Because they own the machines. Now, if you use something you learned, knowledge,
yeah, they
that's
don't
different.
care about that, and that's hard to enforce.
Yeah.
Non-competes vary a lot, and then there's also the variance in ownership of equipment, like what that implies. But like, you just don't want this headache. It's worth paying a little bit and not having the headache.
Oh yeah, I mean, for a while, I think you are still using your own pro version of Visual Studio.
Yes, and ReSharper.
Yeah. So you pay for that, and it goes back to the same kind of thing with paying for your own learning.
Yeah, and the same. My Pluralsight account is the same thing. Work will pay for it, but I like to keep that stuff separate. Now, there's another thing that can happen here too, is they can find out before your side hustle takes off, or find out at a critical juncture. Like if you're already, like if you're getting close to launching something, you're probably working like a dog, and you're probably really tired, and maybe you take some days off because you're sick.
Yeah.
In air quotes or not. And they find out about it, and this stuff is on that machine, and they know that you're releasing. They can fire you right then. Now you've got a launch that you're trying to do while you're unemployed. So like, it's just, you're exposing.
At least you got time to deal with the issues.
Yeah, you got lots of time, but you can be they can put you in a really weird spot. So you're just exposing yourself to trouble.
In reality, you don't have a lot of time because you're going to be looking for another job.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to rely on that.
Unless that side hustle really, really goes well. Yeah. And it's probably not at that level if you were able to build it on the side. Not anymore.
So the next thing is the cost of hosting and running your side project. It's not only the cost of the development tools that you have to consider. Running a real application, it requires money. There's a lot of costs that come along with this. This is something that I learned getting into development, and we started the podcast and things like that I guess I really hadn't noticed when I had done things before. Like, I built the website for my wedding when I got married so that we could live stream it. This was back before Facebook Live and all that. So we could live stream it so my grandmother could watch it.
Yeah.
And I kind of knew a little bit, and I paid for some tools and stuff for that. But I really didn't realize how much was involved until we got into building things, as you were teaching me. And like, hosting fees for websites are pretty low, at least at the lower end. However, you got to watch for web hosts whose costs go up drastically later.
Yeah, or their support goes to crap, or any number of things can happen, right? Like, as you get under load, they'll hit you with charges. Some of the cloud providers are pretty annoying. That we both have been burned by Azure with this, where like your website gets attacked and you get charged for the bandwidth, and it's like, that's not legitimate traffic. You got to consider those costs. You got to consider stuff like email hosting, domains. Your website host may have some limits that you won't see until it's too late. Because it could be everything from, like, I remember back in the day, it used to be, they got to have the front page extensions. Like, this was way back, obviously, but there'll be stuff like that, or stuff where, you need some Apache module to work, and they're like, no, you're not getting access to have that unless you pay this extra. Also,
don't forget the cost of your database and storage. Different databases are going to cost different amounts to run. Those pricing scales, it's another thing that kind of shocked us when we really got into it. Like, it can burn you.
Yeah.
If you're not prepared for it. Now, the initial price may be enough to get going, but you got to be careful.
Yeah, because like a lot of the cheap hosting, they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll let you register a domain name and we'll let you set up a website, and it'll be like $5 a month and you do all this stuff. But what they are counting on is you getting locked in and your domain being hosted there, and they're going to be real slow moving it. If you ever try to move off, it's going to be a giant headache.
Yep.
Because they're counting on that for, you basically ramping up the cost to yourself over time.
It's like as you get more business or more people coming through your site,
they take a larger percentage of it.
Right.
Yeah.
You also need to be careful of which web and database features you use. Pricing tends to go up quickly if you get enterprisey things or large amounts of data are involved.
Yeah, so there's a lot of SQL Server features, for instance, is a real bad one for that, where some of the analytics pieces cost more. And so you may look at that and you go, hey, I have a developer edition and I can do all this stuff on my local box. And then I push out to the real environment and I find that, oh yeah, this thing I spent 4 weeks working on, I can't do that without SQL Server Enterprise and the associated licensing. That really hurts.
Yeah.
So you got to be really careful about that stuff. I mean, and there's lots of other things too. Stuff like security certificates. I mean, Let's Encrypt has helped, but that's not gone away yet. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff to think about.
And the thing is, if things are running really well later, you're going to be reluctant to move hostings unless it's a huge price difference. And this is something that we've faced.
Oh, we've gone round and round about that because we honestly don't want our site to be WordPress anymore. We would love it to be a static website thing. And, that would be so much less effort once it's up.
Unfortunately, I have a full-time job and I'm in grad school now.
Yeah.
Whereas when we built our other static sites and this website for the podcast, I was learning to code. And so this was part of my learning.
Yeah.
And I had like a part-time job that was just helping pay the bills. So yeah, you're
kind of stuck with stuff once you get it is the point here. So you got to be careful what you get. Think of your web host as more like a tattoo than a hair coloring.
Yeah, that's very true. It can be removed, but it costs.
And it hurts. Yeah.
But you can cover it up.
Right. Exactly. And that's called caching, ladies and gentlemen.
So next we're going to talk about platform stability. You may consider it cool when the platform you use for work is getting big updates that drastically improve things. It's really awesome.
.NET Core right now, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of cool stuff coming. I would be very reticent to use it on a side hustle yet. In a year or so, yeah. And I'm pretty conservative on that too. But the thing is, at work, you like it when the platform is unstable because you get to learn new things. But you're not paying for the problems that are caused by that.
However, on a side hustle, you are. It's you.
Yeah.
You are probably making a big mistake if you try to use a framework that isn't stable for a side hustle. Like, I think of when AngularJS, when it first came out, the 1.0.
Yeah.
A lot of people were picking it up because it was really cool, a lot of awesome stuff. And they built their side hustles. They based them on that, or their side businesses based on that. And then Angular 2 comes out and it is a whole nother realm.
Yeah. And they've got to do a whole bunch of work that isn't providing business value.
Right. Just to make that transition, or you keep working in
the old stuff and you keep building up technical debt.
Right.
Which developers, that's going to destroy your morale.
Yeah.
More than anything else. So remember that any time that your framework takes away is taken away from actually getting things done that make you money, or it's taken away from your social life and all the other stuff you care about, like the presumed reasons for doing a side hustle.
Another thing to consider is how stable the code is that runs on the platform. Just because the coding interface is stable doesn't mean that it is particularly stable in a production server environment. Oh my goodness, going to production, I have suffered for this the past few weeks.
Yeah. there's stuff in .NET that'll still burn you.
Yep.
There's stuff in Rails that will still burn you. I remember right before the introduction of Rack, there was this big brouhaha, and I forget who started it, but they were basically talking about how they rebooted their instances of Mongrel every few minutes. Like they restart, and that's like the little web server thread runner deal, basically. You're like, what? Every few minutes? And this was in a production environment. Like, it was crazy talk. And stuff like that happens. But you don't want to be the one finding out about this. The whole thing sounds ridiculous, but lots of rapidly developing systems haven't been well tested under production workloads. Mm-hmm. We ran into this with a document database provider that we were using years ago at a previous employer. And now it's like super stable. It's not a problem. But, we were on the bleeding edge. We had some of the biggest databases that they had. Mm-hmm. And we were having to call overseas to get help. And so like you call at night. Mm-hmm. And, you get help on this stuff. So, I mean, it was a bit rough. A lot of times the only way this sort of stuff really gets tested is for somebody to put a system under load. And then you find out that, oh yeah, this doesn't work real well. You don't want to be that person, because it really sucks if you've got a side project and it falls over at night and you have to get up and deal with it. And then you go to work in the morning. Trust me, I've been there. You do not want that. Oh,
hey, you know what? We've had some issues where the server went down when we were going to be publishing an episode. And so because it was scheduled to go out at midnight,
it didn't.
And it didn't, like, when it came back up, it didn't go, oh, hey, this had a release time prior to the current time, so it needs to be released. It just missed it.
Yeah.
And
I remember that.
I got a call from one of the minor reasons I missed Jason, but one of them is he was waiting on our episode to drop. He didn't sleep much, so he would sit up and listen to it and call me if there was an issue that I needed to fix before the morning. And
but it's rough. Like when you go into work the next morning after having to troubleshoot a server at night, like that's awful. Even if it's for your day job, like that's bad enough. But at least they understand. Whereas if it's for a side hustle, that you can't bring that up.
No, you shouldn't talk about that.
So speaking of the ecosystem of other people, you also need the ability to get help when you get stuck. Mm-hmm. That is a huge one. If you're doing anything interesting, you're probably pushing the limits of your own skill and knowledge, if not the platform that you're using. At some point, you're going to need help. So you don't want to use tools that limit the help you can get.
You may also want to bring another developer in on the project at some point. And if you're using a weird platform or language, that's going to take longer to either find someone that knows it or get someone up to speed on it.
You really want a large active developer community for a lot of reasons. Besides the need to get help at some point, having a large development community around the platform you're using makes it a lot easier to find libraries that can do stuff for you. It's like you talk to some external service, you don't have to write a REST client for it. There is one. Like that's an enormous amount of time that you don't want to spend.
A large development community also makes it more likely that you can find people who've already solved problems that you're likely to encounter, which is very useful while you're evaluating designs. So, I think about this because it's on both ends, like both extremes, the brand new stuff, like when Go first came out. I heard some podcasts about it. I looked into it. I was really interested in it, but there was not a lot of community there. You go the opposite direction. So you're doing Delphi at work. There's not a big Delphi community.
Yeah, but nothing's changed.
Well, that's true.
And a lot of stuff like...
But you go to something older.
Yeah.
And you're not going to have as much community. So there's kind of a sweet spot in, like, it's a bell curve, basically.
Well, it's like if you use a newer technology, all the help is people. Mm-hmm. And if you use an older technology, all the help is docs. Or you might be able to find a developer at the doctor. It's old enough. But like your limits really
that was one of your best dad jokes ever, man. Yeah, that was good.
It was the point here is that just because you start a project alone, that doesn't mean that you can ignore the role of a good ecosystem to work with. Not only will a good ecosystem help you avoid being stopped cold by a roadblock, but they'll also help you to avoid them in advance. So you can ask questions and go, oh, wait, this is going to be a huge screw up that's going to paint me into a corner because of something about the language or the platform or whatever.
And this goes back to something that we kind of harp on a lot, and that is planning.
Yeah.
You know, building a side hustle is a long and lonely road and is tough enough without a good community around you.
Yeah. I've done several different side hustles. And one thing that's really, really rough is sitting up and it's 11:30 on a Saturday night and you've got another 4 hours of coding to go and you are completely discouraged and you are stuck on a problem. Like that is not a happy place. You do not want to be trying to do.
Well, one of the nice things about knowing you is unless it is like the language was written a year ago, you've probably used it.
Yeah.
At some point, because you're like me, you like to learn new stuff and play around with things. So now that we've talked about sort of the tools and platforms and the building of the app, we're going to get into some considerations you need to take on the running of the app. First, the ease of deployment and management is really important. It goes without saying that if you are building something on the side, you are eventually going to have to both deploy it and manage deployed instances of it.
Yeah. So it may be interesting and fun to play with systems and learn how the pieces fit together. But that goes right out the window when money starts getting involved. So like you may want to play with Apache and Nginx and do all this other stuff. But you got a PHP site you need to push out. The reality changes that whole equation because it stops being fun when it starts costing you money to learn by the minute.
Having a solid deployment configuration can help you avoid having your project derailed at a time you don't have control over it. Like when you're at work.
Yeah. So if something goes down and it's like, okay, I've got to get, like this server just completely died at the web host. They've got another server for me to put stuff on. How quick can I get it over there? Assuming that they've handled the database backups or whatever, how quick can I get back up and running? And oh, by the way, you're at work. So maybe you've got your laptop with you and, you can go and take an early lunch and go to the McDonald's down the street. What does your recovery strategy look like?
I remember there was one or two times back before I had my current job where you were on your way into work and went to go listen to the episode that had just come out and called me because our website was down.
Yep.
And, I wasn't going in until later in the day. So I was able to actually get on my computer and figure out what was going on and fix it.
Yeah. Deployment is easier now than it used to be, but there are some things that can be kind of difficult. You're probably going to either want to do Docker containers, which is preferable, like as far as actually getting stuff out there and getting it running. Like, holy cow, like configuration as code is amazing. If you can get that working. Now you got to do work to get that ready.
That's true.
Or you need to be able to just copy files out somewhere and have everything work. That's what they call an Xcopy deployment, which is the way that I've done stuff, pre-Docker, because that was the easiest way. Like you don't want to have to install DLLs and all that kind of stuff. And you go, okay, if this requires installing a system DLL, I can't use it.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think because like at work, we have a DevOps guy that deals with all that.
Yeah. There's a reason there's a dude for that.
Right.
Even if it's a female dude. Right. A dudette.
A dudette? I don't know. Nobody uses the term dudette anymore.
I know. But yeah, it's like I say dude in the gender neutral sense, but like it's somebody handles that at your work. You're going to have to handle it here. So you want it to be as minimal as possible or it's going to suck.
Again, the idea is to avoid having to tinker with settings when a system is down. This also protects you against the web host making a configuration change with a script and breaking your stuff.
Right. Because like if it's in a Docker container, like that's kind of self-enclosed. Whereas if it's like, oh, hey, I'm using these PHP settings on this host. And I don't know, you've got a WordPress site that like, let's say you host a podcast and your server admins go in and say, I think that this directory under here should be protected and people shouldn't be able to get to these pages. Because that's never happened. You don't want that, especially when you're at work because you're like, what do I don't get to eat lunch today because somebody else screwed up. Like you got to think about that sort of stuff. You also need to be able to easily manage the software once it's out there. And this is both manual and automatic, and you've got to have both.
Would probably be better off with a GUI when you're just getting started, just so that you can get going and so you can quickly handle problems as they arise.
Yeah, because you're not going to really know all the little quirks of a deployment until you actually deploy.
Yeah. And you don't want to be reading wikis about command line parameters when a system's down. However, you do also eventually need console access and probably some sort of scheduled task runner so that you can automate things once you've done them manually. And this is one of the really cool things that we've got going on where I work is we are moving to an automated build server.
Yeah,
which
we
is
are too.
It's eventually going to be so cool because right now we've got the dev environment set up on it. So whenever I push my commits into our Git repo, rebuilds and redeploys.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Another thing you're going to want to consider is your ability to connect with other platforms. No application is an island. Whether you want your users to be able to sign in with OAuth to import their data from other applications, or even to integrate well with their own stuff, you pretty much have to live in an environment where your stuff interacts with other people's stuff that you don't control.
Not only are there a lot of security implications to integrating with other platforms, there can also be a lot of complexity. It's a pain, really.
Yeah. I mean, we have integration points for this podcast that do stuff like dump messages out into Slack. And was it when Kanban board cards get moved, it puts files out there for us. It's little stupid stuff, right? Those things break.
Yeah.
And they're just not, there's not much there. They're not business critical. It's annoying when they break. But this happens. Now, I'll tell you a story about Facebook integration. Because I worked at a company and I had to do a Facebook integration and they broke stuff on us all the time. Facebook's motto is move fast and break things. They don't mean their things. They mean your things.
Right.
And so like I was frustrated and I like typed into Google search, Facebook integration sucks. Right. And I found this poll that they did, and this was probably 2012 or so. There was a poll about which company was the worst social media provider to integrate with. And Facebook won resoundingly.
Yep.
But the first comment under there just about killed me because somebody wrote, Facebook is only the worst one to integrate with because there is no word in the English language that's worse than worst. And that's all the comment said. And I just about fell out of my chair because I've been fighting with it for like 3 days.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
So what this means is that you need pretty easy support for several common integration methods. Webhooks will need to be supported for cases where applications are calling into your application over the web.
Yeah, and one of the most common ones for that is stuff like payment providers, email service providers, stuff that you send it a request and you're like, okay, call me back when you're done. You got to be able to support that workflow pretty easily. You also need to be able to support things like OAuth if you plan to integrate with third-party websites, especially on behalf of your users. So like they're using QuickBooks, you need to get in there and do stuff at an API level. You got to go through that whole workflow.
You will probably want fairly decent and clean ways of dealing with your JSON or XML data as well.
Yeah, and this is not something that's as much of a problem as it used to be. But it's still a problem in some platforms. I've got a friend that wrote his own JSON parser in Visual Basic. Not too long ago.
That just sounds painful.
It was. He's a tough dude, I guess. He decided that's where he was going and he went there. You don't want to do that on a side hustle.
Oh no.
Or probably at all, but you don't want to do it when you're trying to make money on the side. Your platform is also going to need to play nicely with other systems that you intend to use for business. You're probably going to need to integrate with a payment provider or two, for instance. And that can be kind of nasty.
Analytics. This is something that I've been working on personally, just sort of side project at work, including, but not limited to Google Analytics are also going to be in the mix when you try to make money off of an application.
Yeah. So you need to see where your website traffic is coming from, like what keywords are driving people in there, what features are getting used. So you're going to use stuff like Segment or you're going to use stuff like Hotjar. There's all these different tools that you hook in, especially like on the JavaScript side, that you've got to figure out how that fits in your ecosystem. And you don't want a platform that burns you on that.
You'll probably have an easier time of it using something that is widely used, at least if you want a supported SDK.
Right. So if you don't want to have to write a raw REST client for something, and you're using like C#, Java, JavaScript, some of the common languages, those companies probably have built an SDK. Whereas if you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to use Forth to do this, you're probably going to be writing a REST client.
That's true. What I think about when I read this was the Amazon Alexa app, or skill, I should say. It has an SDK because the Alexa code does all the machine learning and things like that, where you just pass it in like intents, and it's like you give some sample utterances that people might say, and then it can figure out, like, once it's in your skill, it can figure out based on those samples. Okay, like if you say, for example,
Alexa, are there any gators in Smoky Mountain National Park?
And you got to say it just like that.
Yeah. I was thinking like Alexa, and then if you put in as your example, what are the books by, and then you have like an author variable, but you say, hey, what has Terry Goodkind written? Then it will, if you have enough samples, it will figure out, oh, that's what you mean to ask. And so that's kind of neat. But the cool thing is they have an SDK for all that, or it's just a JSON file. So you could generate the JSON with all that information in there and just push it up.
Probably want the easier road, especially when you're trying to make a minimum viable product to test out, and you're going to be pivoting and doing a whole bunch of stuff. You don't want to dump 6 months into some obscure feature that you may throw away later, because it's going to make you overly attached to it. So you want the easiest way to get there first.
Oh man, one of the most fun things I did at my job early on was taking this arcane coordinate system and converting it into long and lat so that we could do that exact thing, put it into a map and stuff. And that was really, really cool.
Yeah. Well, and you just get a mixture of stuff. And speaking of which, another thing your tool probably needs to be able to handle is mixed environments. Now, there was a time when you could reasonably expect all or most of your users to use a single browser, a single operating system, a single mobile platform. I remember those days, and you do too, and we're never going to see those again. Your stuff has to work well in a mixed environment.
This means things like supporting multiple mobile environments are not only reasonable, but expected. Of course, at this point, there's 2 mobile environments.
Yeah, well,
you don't have a Windows mobile environment anymore.
Right, but you also have multiple versions of Android.
Yeah.
You have multiple versions of iPhone. You have iPad. You have Android tablet.
Yeah.
And you have some things that are mobile in air quotes, but it's actually like a portable computer.
Right.
And then you have like
the thing is, what is a phone tablet and what is a laptop have blended.
Yeah.
So you have like a lot of crossover.
Now, this can also mean things like handling display resolutions that may be anywhere from an ultra high def widescreen on a high end Mac, all the way down to a really crappy commodity phone display, or potentially some little display on an IoT device.
That's very true. I hadn't thought about that. Now that brings a whole nother realm into it.
Yeah.
Is the IoT world. Now, like, I built a computer from a Raspberry Pi for my nieces that they can get on and play games, and I have Scratch on there for them to learn a little bit of coding so they can code like Uncle BJ. But, you may have to support that.
Yeah, and the fun thing is, it's going to be nearly impossible to test all the configurations that you're going to encounter in the wild ever.
Yeah, so one thing you may have to support is that somebody built a phone in Minecraft. Like a functioning phone in Minecraft that you could call people from.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's like, no, I'm not supporting that. That's horrifying. Why did you do that?
That is so awesome.
Although honestly, I would love to get that ticket, and I would probably be like, okay, let's see if we can make this happen.
I know. Wouldn't it be awesome?
Just because that's bragging rights, but like from a business standpoint, I would not support that. But yeah.
So your users will also make things challenging for you. Some users don't update ever. And, it's interesting because where I'm at work, going back to the network access control episode we had, they have to update their machines. In order to work, they have to do that. But when you're not in an environment like that...
Like a lot of your users.
Yeah. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many people expect their Windows 2000 or Windows XP if you're my mother.
Yeah, and I mean, you'll still see Windows 98 machines out there in places, certain types of environments. There was actually a auto shop in Poland recently that they found that was still using, I think, a TRS-80. And like they're using it for processing their invoices and all this stuff, and they were wanting to update their system, I think. And somebody just goes, I have no idea how to even start on that. I don't know how you would start on Like, how would you get stuff off of there? Like that's something that's going to take a minute. So people don't like to update, except when they do, because that's the other side of it. Other users want you to support the very latest version of whatever platform they use flawlessly. iOS dropped a new version this morning. By noon, they expect it to work perfectly on their phone. You don't have a phone that supports that. And, the vendor may have changed something. Heck, they may have a bug that you don't know about. They just dropped a new OS.
Mm-hmm.
And it's real bad on the automatically updating ones because, like for instance, Microsoft can push something that breaks your stuff and you don't have a recourse to it. Like you just got to deal with it.
The real fun stuff happens though when the constraints of a user with a cheap machine or low memory, slow CPU, don't know anybody in this room that's ever had that problem.
Yeah.
Can't get anything done at all because you optimized for your users with good machines to be able to do things fast.
Yeah. And this is something we run into at work because we have some clients that are a bit slow on updating machines to the point of going, hey, I want to stay on 32-bit.
Yeah.
And things are different. Like the Delphi compiler, stuff acts differently under 32-bit. Like you got to test everything again.
Mm-hmm.
For that to work. And, we've got clients like that. And then we've got clients that are like, oh yeah, here's a cluster, and you try to optimize where both of those people are happy. That there's a very, very thin line that
that's
work
be,
well.
That's a pain.
And you're going to run into that. Now you'll run into it as well when you go from, low power devices to the souped up Mac and you're still trying to run on the same website.
The point is that your user base grows. The constraints that they put on your system will eventually paint you into a corner. No matter what you're doing, that's going to happen. This typically means that your software needs to rest on a stable framework or platform that's able to adjust to your client's platform rather than you doing all the work yourself.
Right. So that probably means not getting into bare metal coding. If you can possibly avoid it. I mean, that's why we have .NET. That's why we have the JVM. That's why we have the Ruby runtime. That's why we have all these other things, is because those platforms are supposed to work well on other platforms. In other words, this is somebody else's problem, and it's hopefully somebody's problem that has more money and time than we do.
Now, while stability is a feature, it's something that clients expect by default and doesn't differentiate your product.
Yeah.
You especially don't want to be in this slugging match when you have a full-time job during the day and this is your side thing.
Yeah, because this is when it'll break, right?
Yeah.
That's when all the users are going to be hitting the system, and the ones that are the slowest and have all the performance issues, that's when they're going to be hitting the system.
Well, it's like with the podcast. We have 2 times on release day that are huge. Morning, when everybody's driving into work, and afternoon, when they're driving home.
Yeah.
And the third point is the next day of morning.
Yeah.
And so that's when we're getting hit a lot. For us, we're driving into work. Well, actually, now we're both working from home, but
On that day, yeah.
Before we were driving into work and we were driving home from work. So if something happened during our peak time,
there's nothing we could do about
it.
And so you don't want to be in that situation, and especially with performance problems, because those are not quick to fix. Now, the last one is your ability to tolerate the language, syntax, or stack that you're trying to use. There's lots of stacks that are real nice to use, but if you don't like them, this is rough. There's a lot of languages that have really cool features that are really impressive. Hello, Python.
I love Python.
It's also possible that there are things that drive you nuts about it. Like in my case, I discovered that I really can't stand how Python treats spaces as syntactically significant because I'm so used to that not being a thing.
Yeah.
And I tried to use Django and I just kept tripping over myself with that one thing.
Well, and I guess it's because I
love my curly braces, by the way, too.
I guess it's because I had been in other environments way back when. And so doing Python reminded me of some of the older stuff I'd done when I was in high school. I like the way it handles data. It handles data as sets like SQL does.
Yeah.
Instead of as objects like
I totally like those features. Like list comprehensions are awesome.
Oh yeah.
In Python. Like that's great. But there's syntactic stuff that I'm like, and like stuff like that is fine when you're playing, when you're trying to do a business thing.
Yeah.
Like you've got to take that into account. Now it may or may not be enough to push you over the edge. Like with Python and the spacing thing, like that irritates me, but there's stuff in Django that is nice enough where I
you can get over it.
Yeah, like just the admin middleware by itself. But yeah.
This is more important than you think. Funky language features that give you heartburn will wear on you with time. And you really have to make that decision like Will's talking about where, hey, that one little thing bothers me, but it's a cost benefit analysis. We've talked about that a lot before where it's like, all right, this bothers me, but these features and the ability to do things like list comprehension, the way it treats data, some of the things that I love about Python.
Yeah.
I look at it and I go, if that doesn't bother me, but if that bothered me, the other things outweigh.
And it might get to the point where it doesn't bother you, but yeah, just be kind of aware of that in the back of your mind that, hey, there's some stuff that's gonna grate after a while. And
you're gonna dislike some things about your underlying platform, no matter what you're using. Your day job platform, there are things about C# that I don't like.
Yes, for instance, not being able to specify a generic constructor that does have parameters. For instance.
I've had that problem too. Not too long ago even.
Please, Anders, if you're listening, fix this. Because, he's going to take our advice on that.
Another thing is neither one of us are likely to build WordPress plugins soon. There's too many things in that ecosystem, especially when you get into security, that just drive both of us nuts. I as much as I love Python, I really don't like PHP. And I have friends I went to high school with that are PHP developers.
I will say this. I hated PHP until the first time I looked at Laravel code.
The problem with WordPress is it's been around forever.
Yeah. And so they've got a lot of technical debt and they've got a plugin ecosystem that was built for another age.
Right. There's a huge difference between something that is cool to learn and fun to support as a side project.
Right. It's like having a car that you tinker with. Like if it's your second car and you like to tinker with it and play around with it and, try to, tweak the engine and do all these other things and you like to do all the mechanic work, that's fine. When you need that thing to get you to the hospital because you're trying to not bleed out, that's a different situation. And that difference in perspective is kind of something that's going through the farm equipment industry right now because a lot of farmers are going, hey, you've made this thing where I can't repair it. And I'm depending on it for my livelihood. Like it's a tinker toy for you guys, but I have to be able to plant my crop.
Yeah. My dad's best friend, I've had conversations with him. The biggest seller right now is tractors from the 70s.
Yeah.
Because they don't have all that stuff in there. And they are trying, he is encouraging some of the young men at his church, like the teenagers, to go into learning how to repair that. Because he's like, you guys have your job set.
Yeah.
Go into the computer side of that stuff. He's like, you're set for life because we have to have this stuff.
It's funny how the mind gets clarified by the inability to eat. And that's where you'll be. So you just got to bear this stuff in mind. Now this probably means that you're not going to want to use something that you're trying to learn for this because you don't know the pitfalls. So that means that you get to fall into every pitfall.
It might also mean that you don't want to use the same language that you use all day and associate with a job situation that you may or may not like. Personally, I love my job, especially when I actually get to code and I'm not putting out fires. And so doing C# on the side would be great. I
wouldn't do web forms though.
No, with school, I'm actually starting to enjoy Java a little bit. I'm seeing some things in it that I like.
Yeah.
And it's writing academic code is kind of fun. When you're like, all right, I know I'm good enough to not read the chapter and pass this. I'm still going to read the chapter for the test later.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of fun, especially looking at the challenges and stuff.
But you wouldn't want to do that trying to build a production app right now, probably.
No, I would not do Java in production right now.
Yeah.
I could. I probably could pull it off just because it's close enough.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to.
Now, this plays more into emotion than objective fact. So in other words, it's not objective, it's subjective.
Yeah.
Because you don't want this kind of emotional friction in your life. So if you're having a bad reaction to something that's in a platform, in a language that you're looking at using, then maybe do something else.
You probably also don't want something that is so far behind that it makes you nervous.
Yeah, so you don't start a new project with ASP.NET Web Forms. Now, Web Forms is still supported. It's still allegedly going forward. But if you look at Microsoft and the way they behave towards it, a lot of the love is gone. I guess the way I would put it is that you don't want to use something that looks like it might go away. Yeah, and I would feel like web forms is that. The other thing too is it's not particularly cool. So getting help and getting other developers involved is going to be a little harder.
I know I've had to deal with some web forms.
Now, see, I deal with it all day. And I would imagine that developers in the Python space kind of still feel the same way about Python too.
Yeah.
Like it's still around. It's still supported thus far. But again, like you don't want to start something in a antiquated platform because if it does go away, you don't want to be 200,000 lines in.
Or in a more front-end perspective, AngularJS.
Yeah.
So guys, side hustles offer a challenge to developers. However, that challenge can easily turn first to drudgery and then to pain. So you have to be careful about the platform you choose. The goal of a side hustle is to eventually get some extra money, which creates an entirely different set of constraints than doing a project with the intent of learning things. Even though you'll learn a ton on a side project. You know what? It's not for everyone, but anyone can give it a try. That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
I just want to throw out an idea or a thing I ran into this week. I was speaking at Nashville Software School, and one of the students asked, about learning other programming languages. And the particular context was that they found out that about 40% of the graduates don't use the language that they learned at the software school in their day jobs. They do some other programming language, and they're really discouraged about this. And it occurred to me that yes, that's a true fact as far as I know from the statistics. But there's also another thing here, and that is that 40% of the students that graduated from there were competent enough to switch languages. And I pointed that out to them, and I said, look, both of these facts are true, but one of these facts is empowering and the other one is not. So I said, my question to you is, why are you picking the one that's not empowering? Like if two facts are both equally true, but one of them makes you feel weak and small and the other one does not, you should pick the one that makes you feel better and focus on that one. So I just want to put that out there as something to consider, because if you're doing a side hustle, like you're going to run into a lot of that kind of stuff too. That's an attitude that you need to adopt. That's all I got.
For Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at completedeveloperpodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Catch us each week as we broadcast live, talking about what's going on in the tech world and answering listener questions.
Learn more about all of our shows and groups by going to CompleteDeveloperNetwork.com, where you'll find links to Junior Developer Toolbox, Developer Launchpad, and our other communities. Thanks for listening. See you next time.